There are four main core inner child wounds, and there may be some others floating around there, but these four inner child wounds can show up in your life in many ways. And in this video, I'm going to be sharing with you what those four main inner child wounds are and how you can begin to have the awareness about these wounds so you can finally take that step on your healing journey. So with that being said, let's dive in. Hello and welcome back to my channel. For those that are new, my name is Christina and I help empower people on their spiritual and healing journey. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and the bell notification so then you don't miss a video, because it's my mission to make sure that you have a fulfilling and purposeful driven life. So let's dive in. So inner child wounds, this can be a touchy subject, but if you're here watching this, it means you have begun to take that step to finally see if you have a wound and address your inner child wounds. So I congratulate you here right now, because you're one of those that are actually doing the work. But inner child wounds can have a really devastating effect on our lives, because it is how we form our relationships based on our wounding, based on the beliefs we pick up in childhood. It can form toxic behavior patterns or unwanted behavior patterns that keep us in a loop because we are operating from our inner child wounds. And the four main inner child wounds are a guilt wound, trust wound, abandonment wound, and a neglect wound. The trust wound could also be seen as the betrayal wound, but I just refer it to as trust because it's easier for everybody to understand what trust means. So these four wounds are exactly the same as a physical wound. We think of a physical wound as a gaping hole, a sore, something that's painful. And what do we do if we have a wound? We cover it up. And I always think of this sometimes when I'm watching a war film. When somebody has a disgusting, nasty wound in a war film, what they do is cover it up with some dirty, rotten, horrible bandage. And I'm sat there thinking, oh my God, that's just going to get infected. They're not seeing to the wound. They're not like cleaning it. Oh my God, we know what's going to happen here. He's going to get infected. He's going to die. I don't think that's even with just war films. That's with anybody that hurts themselves in a film. You're like, well, you know what's going to happen here. It's just going to get infected and then they're going to die. But that's the thing with these wounds. We have to get to that horrible bit that we are just covering up. And it's the same with an inner child wound. And with an inner child wound, what we are doing is the same thing, is covering it up and trying to not think about it, trying to not see it and think that it's not there. But subconsciously, the inner child will always be there. Your wounds will always be there, and it's the same as a physical wound, except that it's just an emotional wound, emotional pain instead of a physical pain. And when we put that bandage on, what that is we begin to self-soothe. And how do we self-soothe? By addiction, toxic behavior that can sabotage our lives with numbing the pain. We go to foods, we go to drugs, we go to porn, we go to whatever that self-soothing thing is that brings you kind of temporarily release and peace, what you perceive as peace. And what we are doing is suppressing that actual wound. We're trying to cover it up, and the bandage is just dirty and grotty and horrible, and we leave it there to fester, and then it becomes infected. And then that's when we are letting the inner child wound play out in our lives. They are running the show, and this is when we form toxic relationships. We self-sabotage, We have toxic behavior patterns that are on autopilot constantly. And this is why it can be so life destroying if you have no awareness of it. But by watching this video, you're going to have way more awareness of your inner child wounds by the end of this video. So the first inner child wound I'm actually going to talk about is abandonment. And here are just some of the signs that you may have an abandonment wound. It could be fear of being left alone. You can end up in codependent relationships to meet your needs. You depend on that other person to make you feel whole and complete, and then you don't want to leave them, or you fear them leaving. So sometimes you don't get close to people as well because you may fear them leaving you. And an abandonment wound can come from a parent abandoning you. It can come from being left alone to deal with your own emotions. It can also mean emotional abandonment. And that means when your parents weren't emotionally available to you, they didn't show you love, they didn't show you that unconditional love that most parents should have. And another sign that you may have an abandonment wound is you have low self-worth. You don't feel like your needs matter and that you should be left alone. You feel like you are not good enough because you feel like somebody left me because I wasn't good enough, because that's the sort of things children internalize. So the second wound is the guilt wound, and this wound is a big one, the guilt one, because the guilt wound is the people pleaser wound. We could say that the people pleaser is formed because of all the wounds, but the guilt wound is the one that where we do things for other people so then they don't judge us and then we don't feel guilty. We try and please them in order to get what we want because we feel guilty about speaking up for what you want. So that's a sign that you may have a guilt wound. What can happen is you attract people into your life that make you feel guilty, make you feel like you're not worthy, and then all your needs are put on the back burner. You start self-abandoning in order to please the other, so then they don't feel guilty, and then you don't have to feel like guilt if you let somebody down. And often guilt wound can come from being put down in your childhood, being blamed for things that were perfectly normal and natural. Maybe you were put down for being your authentic self, so then you felt guilty about that. And if you're interested in wanting to know what your actual main core inner child wound is, I have an inner child wound quiz. This quiz will help you determine and find out what your dominant inner child wound is and how that is playing out in your life. Because we all have destructive behaviors, toxic behavior patterns, unconscious beliefs that are on autopilot, that run our lives, that are running the show. And if you fill out this quiz, you'll be sent a personalized report about your wound and some steps you can take to begin to heal your inner child wound. So click the link in the pinned comment below or in the description box, and that will take you straight to the quiz, because these things are so fun. I've done it myself and it takes no time at all. It's 60 seconds, maybe even less if you're a quick reader. It's 10 questions, so no time wasted. So the third core wound of an inner child is a trust wound. This one can be so self-destructive. We have self-destructive behaviors when we feel we cannot trust. The trust wound is one where someone has maybe betrayed you when you were younger. Your needs weren't met, so you felt like you couldn't trust your external environment, so you don't feel safe in the world. So that this means you may struggle to have balanced and healthy and meaningful relationships. Maybe you don't form relationships because you feel like you cannot trust. And sometimes if you have a trust wound, it can mean that you isolate a lot. You feel you have to do everything yourself because you cannot trust somebody else to do it. You may have a controlling tendency. I think all of the inner child wounds does create a controlling aspect in ourselves because we control to try and create safety out of all of our traumas, our difficult experiences, our wounds, whatever you want to call it. So we try to control outcomes to feel safe in our environment. And so the fourth and final one is the neglect wound. And the neglect wound is kind of self-explanatory. You were maybe neglected as a child, your needs weren't met, particularly in the early years. And so you picked up that my needs don't matter, I must not matter. So then you have low self-worth, so you have low self-esteem. So maybe you feel insecure about your life, your body. You just kind of self-destruct and go in these negative loop spirals because you're feeling insecure about something. And I know I can get like this. I'm somebody that has really struggled with worthiness and feeling insecure for my whole life. And it's only because I've done that inner work and I went through my spiritual awakening that I was able to become consciously aware of my self-destructive thoughts because I was feeling insecure. And I remember when I went back to college a couple of years ago now to study photography because I was kind of going through a phase. I thought that was my passion. And I do love photography, don't get me wrong. I do love being creative with the camera. But I've now realized that whole experience was just helped me become consciously aware of my lack of self-worth, my lack of confidence, how insecure I actually feel. Because often I would put myself last when we had to do a photo shoot and we was all sharing like one camera and all the other students were behind me watching me, and I felt like I always had to put myself last, or I would draw the short straw because I didn't feel like I was good enough. I didn't feel I was a good photographer, good as them. And my tutor always would tell me, the only issue with you is you lack confidence. And it's just been like that my whole life. But now I've shifted that now. I've become aware of that. And I can choose at any moment to reframe that and say, well, actually, no, I'm not low confident. I'm not low confident, not low in confidence. Is that the right word? But I actually can be confident when I want to be. I just did my inner child workshop last week now, last Friday. And it was fine. I was able to do that. I have the confidence when I need to be. And I would do presentations on this course, my photography course, and everybody else was shit scared, but that didn't bother me. So I think it's when it comes to my own skills, I can stand in front of a crowd, but I can feel quite insecure about my skills and my abilities. So then I self-destruct. I have self-destructive thoughts like, I'm not good enough. They have it better. And then I start making excuses of why I can't do X, Y, and Z. And it's not actually an excuse. It's just me feeling insecure about the thing I have to do. So that whole experience of going back into college was just a lesson to help me to bring awareness to my inner child wounds, to my low confidence, my worthiness. It's my worthiness. I don't feel worthy. I don't feel good enough, because I would often as well have to share a camera with the student that was not particularly all that great at photography, and everyone would put her down. Nobody would really want to work with her, and I always kind of felt sorry for her. And I would call people out if they were being mean to her. And I would always put myself last and say, okay, I'll work with her. I'll work with her. And I realized it wasn't because I was actually feeling sorry. It's because I didn't feel good enough. I wasn't worthy to actually go and work with the other people that were much better. So my mind was just completely blown. And all this took was me talking to my partner about it at the end of my day. And I literally said, oh, I had to be put with so-and-so and that. And I said, I'm fed up of having to be put with them and putting myself down. And then at the end of the sentence, what I said was, it's almost like I don't feel and I didn't say the word worthy. I stopped halfway and I was like, oh my God. Now I realize how my behavior patterns play out, how self-destructive I can be and not put myself forward because I don't feel like I'm good enough. And that is an inner child wound that can be from any of these four main core wounds. Because my own childhood was very destructive, very dysfunctional. My dad was a drug addict. He abandoned me. My mum also kind of nearly abandoned me. They divorced. My dad didn't want to look after me because I was very anxiously attached to my mother. And then my mother went to just fuck off one day and leave us all with my dad, and we went searching for my mother. Where the heck is she gone? And we found her in the middle of a town, our local town, and he threw me at my mother and said, like, have her. He couldn't handle my behavior and the fact that I would always cry for my mum. So I ended up moving with my mum, and my brother and sisters stayed with my dad. So I have this kind of joint abandonment wound from my mother and my dad, because my mother was just going to bugger off and leave us all. And my dad didn't want me. My dad didn't want to look after me. And he became a drug addict. And this is not to say either of them are bad. It's just what happened. And they all had their own shit going on. So I went through a lot as a child. And I only saw my dad a handful of times up until he died. I want to say about 5 years ago, I'm not exactly sure. And it felt like a huge relief when he did pass, because I was always so worried about him. So it just felt like a huge weight off my shoulders. So don't forget that if you want to find out what your core dominant inner child wound is, click the link to find out in the quiz below, and I will see you on the next video. Much love.